Hi, friends. Um, I want to talk a little bit today about accompanying children in grief. And I'll say that we're going to spend time in person doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what it means for us as holy listeners, as spiritual directors, to to bring an awareness of trauma and that potential, that reality for some of the children that we're meeting with. And a big part of that is going to the that answer is knowing when to refer, but there's more to it than that, and we're going to do some exploring about how we can not move into a therapeutic space because that's not what spiritual direction is, but how we can apply some insights that neuroscience offers. For today, I want us to focus a little bit more generally on what it is to accompany children who are grieving all kinds of losses, because that is the reality of that's the experience of some of the children that we host. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, and then I'm going to return. Whoops, let's start at the beginning, shall we? I'm going to talk about companioning children in grief. And can we just start by naming that Western cultures are death denying, grief avoiding? Um, it has the pandemic has made that a little more difficult to maintain, but the reality is that we tend to be uncomfortable with grief. We're a culture that cultures that tend to be uncomfortable with grief. And what is it for us to do? What is this moment in our in time inviting us to do to maybe to begin to shift that one child, one listening session at a time? Children are often the forgotten mourners among us, and there are a lot of reasons for that. It can be that the adults are consumed with the loss or with the anxiety around the crisis, and also it's because children, because developmentally they're in a different space, grief shows up differently for them, and what can often happen is that it's assumed that they aren't grieving because it looks different. Um, a child's Tobin Hart, a child's serious question about life and meaning might be dismissed with responses like, "You're not old enough to understand." Um, I Every time I read this line, a few moments in my own parenting journey come to mind, and there's one in particular where my my daughter um, came to me with some questions around grief and around just not understanding a life transition that our family was going through. We had helped start a church, and the time had come. It was a good and necessary but hard thing that we needed to step away and kind of move in a different direction as a family. And we had been a part of this community for many years by that point. Um, and my response was dismissive. I'm sorry to tell you. It was, "Oh, it's not the same for you. It's not as important to you." That kind of message. And I'm grateful that she came to me later and told me how disappointing and how hurtful that had been for her. And we were able to do some repair, and she forgave me, thankfully. But I missed a moment initially to be present with her in her grief as it was, without projecting my own experience, without making assumptions about what hers was, but just to be present with her experience. And so we as holy listeners, because we have a little distance from the fray of what's happening in families, we can hopefully have a little more spaciousness for bearing witness to children's hard stories and to the full range of their emotions. So grief for children often looks like anxiety, looks like worry. They might feel different, like others don't understand because other children don't have the same kind of loss that they have. They might feel guilty or that they somehow caused whatever bad thing that happened. Um, and this is where, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. This is where we as spiritual directors, we're not there to solve their grief. We're not there to rush them through it. We're there to be present within it with them. Um, Again, we're following the consolations, but we make space for desolation. We give it breathing room. We give it safety to come into the light. Um, and yet, um, when a child is has some incorrect ideas about their responsibility or their blame, that's where we can take a little bit of that power back appropriately and correct those ideas. This, you did not cause this. Your not putting your toys away didn't make this accident happen. Because you were angry with someone didn't cause them to get sick, that kind of thing. Excuse my tickle, let me pause and get some tea. Children often put their sadness or their questions on the back burner while the adults around them are grieving. It's allergy season in Texas, so forgive me, I'm going to sip a little tea. Feel free to get your own refreshing beverage as I do so. So kids may put their questions and their sadness on the back burner while adults are actively grieving. What will often happen in families that are going through a crisis or processing a loss is an adult will kind of get to a new normal, and kind of come up for air in processing their own grief, and suddenly they'll be surprised by an overflow, an outpouring of grief in the child, and that's because the child is recognizing there's not breathing room for what I'm experiencing, so they'll put it to the side until it's safe to come into the light. There again, that's where we as holy listeners can provide that a third safe space for those things to be processed. For very young children, grief is often carried in the body. So it might be a headache or a stomach ache or not hungry. It might be a temporary regression developmentally, going back to a pacifier or thumb sucking or bedwetting or something like that. For very young children, they may not understand the permanence of death, and so we may need to help them navigate that. That's where children's stories and picture books can be really helpful for children to engage those things by focusing on digesting the story of another. Children may have limited feelings vocabulary. Lacey talked last week about a color wheel and connecting different emotions with different colors, and maybe even having the child create their own color wheel, so that they can attribute what yellow means for them, what green means for them, what black means for them. But they may start with a feeling of limited vocabulary, and so as much as we can offer them more depth, more range, they can recognize more fully what it is, what their experience is, and how God and goodness and beauty may be present with them in it, and respond to those things. Physical affection can be really important for very young children who are processing loss and grief. We want to be really careful as spiritual directors about safety and boundaries, but sitting close, and that's where as well the blessing that we do at the end can be really powerful. There's we're physically um, bestowing a blessing. We're doing it with our words, and also as the balm or the oil touches their hands, and they get to carry that with them. So that physicality can be really important. Children tend to grieve in really small windows, and to move in and out of sadness and more kind of lighthearted or everyday experiences. Um, what past me needed to know is that that doesn't mean the loss wasn't important. It means that children have less capacity to stay with big emotions, and they need permission to say, I can't talk about that loss right now. So that's where sometimes in holy listening, we may stay with Pokemon, or we may stay with the Jenga tower, and not a lot of words. And can we just say that that permission, that hospitality to to let what is happening underneath process in its own time and its own way. There is such power in that, and such freedom. So when the question of um, what are we doing here? Nothing seems to be happening comes up, as it will, it does for me. That is our invitation to remember that this is the child showing what they're capable of right now and what is safe for them right now. And it's so it is such a gift that we can offer to stay with them without rushing, and without bypassing. It's really important for kids to see grief modeled in adult in age appropriate ways. The kids may be really uncomfortable with adults' tears. I remember when my grandfather died suddenly when I was around 11 years old, and I was very unsettled by my grandmother's very appropriate, understandable grief. And yet, for kids to see that grief is not something to be ashamed of, that's not something to be afraid of, is really important. And we can help them step by step um, to, to create more safety for that. For teens and older children, it can be kind of hard to parse what is developmental and what is grief. And so watching for behavioral changes is really important. Our activities that they used to really savor and enjoy, are those falling off, or sports or time with friends, or games that they enjoy, kind of are they engaging those less? Are they isolating? And things like that. So watching and asking caring questions around those things. What's happening for you? I notice you're not going out for the team this year. What's happening there? What's going on with that? And yet, honoring privacy, again, agency is any ways that we can hand power back, and let the children bring what they choose to bring. And yet, so honoring privacy, and yet there's that dance, that push pull of not uh, not not isolating, privacy but not isolating. So peer support, journaling, again, that's where we as soul companions can really offer some gifts of safety. We won't spend a lot of time here since we're focusing on us as spiritual directors. But when families are mourning, adults have to do their own grief work, and recognizing that grief will be, when you have a community or a family that's grieving together, it'll be kind of like a merry-go-round, with everyone moving in and out of mourning. There's a great video that some of us have spent some time with, from Paraclete Press, around helping children grieve. It's Chris Ford and Paula Darcy, who both experienced the loss of significant others, including children. And so they bring that experience and they talk about grief like a merry-go-round, meaning different members are moving in and out of processing that grief, and they're moving from desolation from consolation, right? And so honoring where the different family members are and negotiating what is it, how can we create the most safety for everybody and the most honor for what each need is at the table here. um, some may want to talk about it a lot, some not so much. Some want to, if you're thinking of or if you're hosting a child that's lost a family member, some of those members may want to visit the grave. Others might be really uncomfortable with that, and so making space and honoring what each person needs to metabolize, to process their own grief is really important, as are some structure and some consistency. So for us as holy listeners, we're on the real or metaphorical blanket, with the children, and there are the tools and the process, tools to recognize the movements in their lives and respond to where God is drawing them, and what is next for them. So that structure of recognize and respond, and us creating empathetic whole, sacred space and honoring that sacred space with them, is a way that we can provide some structure and some consistency. So when companioning a child who's grieving, we listen, we tell the truth when that becomes important. And that means things like in processing death's permanence. No, this person isn't coming back. No, it wasn't your fault. Let's tell the story of what happened. Let's tell the story of where you are. Let's tell the stories of what you hope, of what you miss, of what your longings are, of where beauty is present. Where is God in all of this? Those kinds of things. So again, responding to questions honestly in age-appropriate ways. We are not there to solve or rush their grief, and yet we speak to, we feel the freedom and the invitation to speak into questions of of what is real, and helping them navigate that. It can be helpful to talk about religious figures or historical figures who have experienced suffering. So if you, like me, are in the Christian story, we're in the season of Lent, and stories of Jesus in the desert and of Jesus in the garden, grieving, inviting his friends into his grief, bringing his anxiety and his fear and his anguish and his wish that things could be different freely into God's presence, and experiencing comfort and empowering in that moment. So we can talk about those stories to help children understand that suffering is a part of life, and it doesn't have to be the final word. It doesn't get the last say. Particularly in families and in worship contexts, we can include children in rituals related to mourning. And in our holy listening spaces, that can be engaging the finger labyrinth, that can be prayer beads, that can be blowing out bubbles, letting their grief be released into the air, and entrusted into God's care. So rituals that help children mourn. Let's close that unneeded little window. We can have all of these things, all of these ways of listening, are tools to help children create resilience and cultivate resilience, to not stay stuck in their stories of loss and in their experience of grief, but to move through it um, to um, to new life and to process the stories so that they aren't sort of stranded in their hearts and in their minds and even in their physical bodies. And can we just say here, um, again, going back to the beginning, because we are uncomfortable with grief, um, there can be this tendency to assume that we grieve when we've lost someone we love or when we've lost a beloved pet. But there are all kinds of reasons to grieve, all sorts of experiences of grief within us and in the lives of the children we're hosting. And so, um, attending to those, again, we follow the consolation, but we make room for desolation without rushing and uh, without resisting ourselves. We create hospitality for it to be processed in appropriate ways. So, what about some practical ways to help children process grief and loss? Um, we get to listen with them. We get to create safety for them to ask their why questions, um, and at the same time, Holly Allen, Forming Resilient Children, which is such a helpful text on these sorts of questions. She writes, children may need assistance in making meaning of their experiences. They may need to revisit or even adjust their understanding of God, and they may need to deal with forgiveness issues. And so, spiritual direction, those movements of recognizing and responding, are ways that we can help children make meaning of their experience. We can help them um, bring their understandings or misunderstandings of God or goodness or beauty into the light so that over time they can shift into something that is more true and more whole, um, and more freeing for them. Uh, so, so when children are experiencing loss, Lacey showed the child's artwork last week, where the child had drawn the four circles as he was talking about how school was really hard for him. He wrote, "I hate school," and started with those four fierce circles. So you can invite children to draw with whatever texture and pace and intensity that they want. Because what we know is that alongside or underneath or adjacent to sadness is often anger. And so giving that ways to safely be expressed without violence, to safely be expressed, is really important. You can invite children to create a photo album or draw pictures of family members. You can invite them to simply tell stories about the person that was lost. What do they remember? What do they love? What do they want to carry forward? We can create hospitality for tears. Tears are part of the language at times, and we can make them welcome. We can also invite children to draw a family tree, saying, "Draw who lives with you," because what we know is that uh, that beloved pets, dogs, cats, hedgehogs, fish, um, are often great sources of consolation, not least, always, and not least in times of suffering. You can invite children to create a worry tree. So drawing a tree and some limbs, and let the leaves of the tree be questions or worries or concerns that get to be put on the page and laid down there. We can invite children to write a letter to God, or to blow a letter to God with bubbles, or to sculpt a letter to God with clay or Play-Doh. We can invite children to tear paper or cloth. I've got some paper from a package I received here There's something really powerful about that embodied experience, that holistic embodied experience. You hear the sound, you can feel the rough edges. You can invite children to tear cloth as well. Um, got some, I led a church community of all ages in a Lenten lament service where last night, where they were all invited to bring what they wanted to spend some time grieving from this past season. And so we tore cloth together, and we could hear the sound of the cloth tearing around the room as we engaged our grief together. Um, I'll offer as well a hope and heaviness exercise. This is something that a friend of this class, Kaisa Stenberg Lee, and I offered to some children during the pandemic when shelter-in-place orders were still needed, and so we met with children from all over the United States over Zoom and held a few sessions where and you'll notice there's a movement to attend to desolation and then to also make room for consolation. There's a recognize and there's a respond kind of rhythm in this. So we gathered with children, we invited them to listen to their hearts for what had been hard or sad, and then we invited them to tell the story of those feelings with their hands. And we'd invited their parents to have a few simple supplies, nothing extraordinary needed. So it could be packing paper like I use, it could be old newspapers or magazines or catalogs or anything they had on hand. And the children, we invited the children to tell the story of their emotions with their hands. They could tear as much or as little as they wanted. They got to choose if it was confetti or if they were really big strips. Um, and and then we told them they could listen to their and let their mad and sad feelings talk to them as they tore. They could listen to the sound. They could touch the rough edges. If they had God language, they could ask God to be with them as they tore. If they didn't, um, they could ask love or goodness to be with them as they tore. And I'll tell you, I mentioned the group I hosted last night. Um, a few people shared that as they tore, they came expecting sadness, even tears, but they were surprised by anger that started bubbling up as they tore. And I'll tell you that happens. That's very common when engaging grief, and especially with the tearing exercise. It often gives some safety for anger and for the emotions that are maybe less welcome or less comfortable to come out and to be expressed in safe ways. And so we asked the children to let that happen, and we gave them a chance to process that together, and to talk as much as they wanted to. Some children chose to stay silent and keep their experience between them and God, and that was okay. And others wanted to talk about what they noticed and how they felt God was with them, and what their heart experienced as they were tearing, letting their grief, letting the story of their loss be told with their fingers in that way. And then we invited the children to bring some art paper, and to take some of the torn strips from their tearing exercise, as many or as few as they wanted, and to begin to create a collage. They could add family photos, pictures from magazines, and kind of tape or glue and use markers or paint or crayon to create an image of what is good in their lives right now, what is hopeful, and to even tune into their dreams and kind of imagine what they hope for the future, what they're praying for the future, and let the collage be that. And in that, um, the brokenness, the thing that expressed their sad story, got to be part of creating the creating what's next, or dreaming about what's there, the new story, the now story. And in that way, we are a resurrection people, that new life gets to come from loss, and from even from death, right? And so, yeah, in that way, children get to embody um, that experience, and that hope, and that trust. Let me see here. Here we go. Um, Again, you have a long list in your syllabus of books, children's books, that engage the full range of children's experience. But stories about grief and loss can be so powerful. They can provide a good, safe distance and a way to engage loss with children. And so you can ask, who are you in this story, and why? And do you have a favorite page, and what's special about that page? Things like that. Some of these books, perhaps all, are on your reading list, but I just wanted to sort of put them out here, like a wonderful mosaic or menu of ways that grief and loss can be engaged. So this one is about sadness in general, and safely engaging emotions. Both of these are when sadness is at your door, when crying is like the rain. I Love You Like Crazy Cakes is a story about international adoption, and about the love and consolation, and also the grief and loss that's part of that story. A Terrible Thing Happened. That is about the experience of trauma, and finding helpful listeners and therapeutic listeners after that. The Story of a Storm is a book created by children about living through a catastrophic environmental experience. Lacey talked about I Never Saw Another Butterfly last week. It's children's drawings and poetry from the Terezin Ghetto concentration camp. Hope and Dog Heaven are both stories about the special relationship that children can have with their pets. An Invisible String is just a lovely book around connections of love that endure beyond distance and even beyond death. And there's actually an activity book that has come out since this publication that I highly recommend looking into. And then Dark Suns engages stories of divorce and division, and racialized violence in some really unique and interesting ways. And then Lacey's All Will Be Well as Nana Upstairs and Downstairs address the loss of a beloved grandparent, and processing the grief of that. So I'll stop here. Again, we will gather together and talk about these things more deeply in person. And I look forward to seeing you then. Meanwhile, take good care.